feel free to take a seat. Leave your stuff there if you would prefer that. You're okay. Thanks. For 5 to 7 minutes. I'll open up with maybe like 5 minutes of remarks and then introduce everybody and then hand it over to you guys to go ahead and give your speeches. I'll ask a question or two and then we'll turn it over to the audience. So it should be like an hour to an hour and a half. 7 to 10 minutes.
7 to 10.
Yeah, did I say 5 to 7?
No, it's okay. We can cut it shorter if you want. But.
Yeah, 7 to 10 is good. What is the sequence? So we'll go this order. Oh, really? Yeah, unless you want us to go in the aisle.
Yeah, let's go up.
Okay. Francisco, you okay with speaking first? We'll go in the opposite order.
Sure.
Okay. Awesome.
The only reason maybe it makes last is because I'm doing like U.S. advocacy stuff, so it might be good to like wrap up. But
Maybe
again,
better to wrap up. Okay.
yeah, just because then that's more like this is what's been done, right?
Yeah. Okay, so maybe what if we do Dan, Matt, and then Wei, and then Francisco?
Okay, perfect.
That work? Okay. All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation. We're so excited to have you here today to have this conversation with everyone. I think it's a timely one and an important one to cover, and I'm really, really excited to have so many wonderful speakers here today. I'm going to open with a couple of just opening remarks. When you came in, I hope that you had the chance to grab our hot off the presses paper. This new paper is looking at the next steps for the U.S. to hold the Burmese military accountable for its human rights violations. This is really building on, I think, overarching heritage research that's been urging the U.S. government to consider broader reforms to U.S. policy toward Burma, but it was written specifically in response to the latest UN report, the fact-finding missions reports on the vast Burmese military's economic interests. I think that any casual observer of Burma cannot ignore the Burmese military. And I think it's really impossible to study Burma without understanding some of the complex power-sharing dynamics that exist between the civilian government and the military power-sharing arrangement. The system itself has, frankly speaking, enabled impunity. It's enabled human rights violations, and it is without question the root of the problem. When the Rohingya crisis took place in August 2017, it was a symptom of this broader problem that the world could no longer ignore, couldn't deny, and could no longer hold out hope that fundamental transformation had taken place after the 2015 elections. I think at the heart of this issue is a central issue that all of us have talked about for a while. That's accountability. The Burmese military is not accountable to its citizens. They do not view their job as the preservation of first freedoms and of human rights. They demonstrated through their treatment of the Rohingya, but also other minority groups in Shan and Kachin State and otherwise, that the Burmese military views it as their right to violate the rights of other individuals. That audacious claim that the Burmese military continues to carry out and live out really demands a response. And that is why I wrote this paper and have written several other papers focusing on these issues. I just wanted to highlight very briefly a couple of the solutions that we highlight. There are many other recommendations that are in this paper, but there are 3 that I wanted to draw your attention to in particular. The first is that the U.S. should really be considering more severe sanctions measures, not just using pre-existing authorities like the JADE Act or using global Magnitsky, which Treasury has in order to target individuals on the basis of corruption or human rights grounds, but also looking at some of the more obscure tools, for example, in the anti-money laundering counterterrorist financing, including Section 311 of the USA Patriot Act, which enables Burma to be designated as a primary money laundering concern. Those sanctions shouldn't just be limited to individuals. They shouldn't just be visa restrictions, as we've seen the U.S. government already put into place earlier this year in July 2019, but they should be financial sanctions, and they should have implications that hit the Burmese military where it really hurts, which is in their pocketbook. The second would be that the U.S. government needs to issue a legal determination on the atrocity crimes that were committed. There's substantial evidence, both from the UN, but also from other civil society organizations, that genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes may have taken place. And so there's a strong need for the U.S. as a global leader to issue that determination. And third and finally, the U.S. government needs to consider a broader reset to its policies toward Burma, not just in light of the Rohingya crisis, but in light of the fact that impunity, human rights violations, and freedom continue to occur there and should be put to a stop. So now I want to turn to the part of the show that you all are most looking forward to, which is our other remarkable panelists, which I'm very excited to host today. We're going to go in a little bit of a circuitous order, I think. We're going to have Dan Sullivan speak first. Dan is the Senior Advocate for Human Rights at Refugees International. He focuses on Myanmar, Sudan, South Sudan, and other areas affected by mass displacement. Prior to joining Refugees International, Dan worked for 5 years with United to End Genocide, which was formerly Save Darfur. First as a senior policy analyst, then as director of policy and government relations, leading strategic planning, report writing, and development of policy recommendations on Myanmar, South Sudan, Syria, and prevention of genocide and mass atrocities. He also has a robust set of other experiences that I would refer you to in his bio. The second speaker that we are going to turn to is Matt Smith. Matt is the co-founder and chief executive officer of Fortify Rights, a human rights organization based in Southeast Asia that supports human rights defenders and investigates human rights violations, combining two commonly separated areas of the human rights movement. He has been published extraordinarily widely, and actually right now is at the Carr Center at Harvard, where he's doing a fellowship there. Then we're going to turn to Wei Wei Nu, who is a political prisoner for 7 years under the Burmese military government. She was released in 2012 under a presidential amnesty. She is currently the executive director and founder of Women Peace Network, a platform that built peace and mutual understanding between Myanmar's different ethnicities and attempts to empower and advocate for the rights of marginalized women in Arakan and Myanmar, and focuses primarily on campaigning for women's rights issues among a number of other illustrious activities that she's engaged in. And then finally, we'll have Francisco Bencosme, who is the Asia Pacific Advocacy Manager at Amnesty International USA. Francisco has testified before Congress and has provided media commentary on multiple outlets, including the New York Times, Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal. In 2018, Francisco was named one of the Hill's top 2018 lobbyists for his campaign on Burma and Rohingya issues. And prior to that, he served as a professional staff member on the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee, where he assisted Democratic senators on issues related to East Asia Pacific and a host of other issues. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dan to kick off our conversation.
All right, thank you, Olivia. And happy to be on this great panel, and looking forward to hearing from everyone. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about, I think that the main point is that not only have some of the abuses that Olivia talked about and others will talk about, and that have been well covered by the UN fact-finding mission, State Department reports, other human rights groups reports, not only have those happened in the recent past, but they're ongoing. I think that's really important to stress. But first, just a quick word on Refugees International, that we're an independent advocacy organization, that we don't take any government funding, and we don't have operations in the field, which kind of gives us a chance to be independent. And so I've been going to Bangladesh over the last several years, from before the August mass expulsion that happened, and then several times since, and we'll actually be heading back tomorrow to kind of get the latest on the humanitarian situation and various things that are happening there, which I'll touch upon briefly. But yeah, in terms of not just the recent past, but ongoing. My last trip to Bangladesh, I spoke with several Rohingya who had just come across the border from Myanmar, or Burma. So this is something that it's nowhere on the level that it was at the height of the crisis, but there still are people coming over, and what they tell you is that a lot of these abuses are happening, and in many ways, the situation there is actually getting worse. So when we're talking about more than 700,000 who came across to Bangladesh, nearly 1 million Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh, and some 600,000 maybe who are still in Rakhine State, a lot of discussions are going on about the returns and repatriating the Rohingya from Bangladesh, but the sad reality is that the conditions are nowhere near conducive to returns in Rakhine State. And as I said, speaking to people who've been there recently or recently come from there, it's in many ways getting worse, and that's in a few different ways. One is the dynamic this past year with the Arakan Army and the fighting with the Myanmar military, which has affected Rohingya as well. And added increased restrictions, including internet blackouts. There's the whole policy of the national verification cards, and several people that I interviewed said that they were forced to accept them. Whereas the officials in Myanmar will tell you that's a way of providing a potential path to citizenship. That's far from the truth, and something that the Rohingya themselves understandably do not believe. There's a lot of precedent for for the Myanmar officials, authorities pulling back on those kinds of things. But the reality is that people I spoke with talked about ongoing sexual violence, forced labor, increasing restrictions on people's freedom of movement. And even where there's talk of, there's still some 120,000 plus Rohingya who have been in camps since 2012, and talk of closing those camps. And Myanmar officials have said that they're moving forward according to the Kofi Annan Commission's recommendations. But in reality, to the extent that any camps have been closed, they've basically just built some structures right next to those camps and sort of said, okay, now this is a village and no longer a camp, but it's effectively the same thing. So all these kinds of things, just to say that things aren't getting better, they're actually getting worse, and we're still a long way from any kind of conditions conducive to returns. Just to quote a couple of people, there was a 70-year-old woman who had been to 4 different villages on her way to get into Bangladesh, and what she said was she saw these abuses in different places and said, I would not dare to say it's safe for people to go back. Another woman whose husband was a mullah, a religious leader, said that she doesn't know, she was arrested. She was forced to flee. She said, I don't know why, I just know being a mullah is a crime. So there's still that religious aspect as well. So moving on from that, there's, the root causes are still in Myanmar and need to be addressed there. I'll talk about a few recommendations in addition to what Olivia said for what ways to put pressure on Myanmar to address those root causes. But at the same time, there are also increasing concerns about Bangladesh. Bangladesh has been should be praised for welcoming in this huge number of refugees that have come in. But in recent months, there's been increasing restrictions on Rohingya refugees and their ability to even volunteer with NGOs, to use cell phones, things that are really helpful for them in knowing, being informed about conditions and being included in any kind of serious discussions about whether to repatriate or now to be relocated potentially to this island in the Bay of Bengal, Bhasan Char. So on repatriation, there's often, I think the officials in Bangladesh and others will say, this is, we went through the exercise to give people that opportunity. We had buses waiting for them. Nobody showed up. This just shows that's all on Myanmar, no harm. But in reality, it is causing harm when you go through these exercises. And there's people who find themselves on the list for repatriation who don't know how they got onto that list. and reports of attempted suicides and just general re-traumatizing of a largely traumatized population already. And then just quickly on Bhasan Char, the island, the plans to move Rohingya to Bhasan Char are moving apace. There'll be an international assessment next week, so that it will be delayed a little bit, at least, from what the authorities in Bangladesh had wanted. But there's a lot of concerns about Rohingya who found themselves on the list and don't know why, or being coerced by leaders in the camps. So a lot of unanswered questions about protection, freedom of movement, and logistics, and protection when there is flooding or cyclones, what's going to happen. So that continues to be a concern. And I'll just end with a few recommendations, just to echo the need for accountability through International Criminal Court or an ad hoc tribunal, or in any way that it can be pursued. So the International Court of Justice, the case introduced by the Gambia, we largely support that. And then the need for targeted sanctions on military-owned enterprises and on military leaders. Sustained humanitarian aid, pushback on moves like the Bhasan Char to make sure that any kind of movement or repatriation truly is safe, voluntary, and informed. And that Rohingya are included in these discussions. And then finally, just an appeal for U.S. leadership, where you've seen some senior officials have engaged. Vice President Pence confronted Aung San Suu Kyi at the U.S. ASEAN Summit last year. Didn't attend this year, but we haven't seen the president himself talk about one of the worst mass atrocities that's happened during his time. The only thing we've seen is where a Rohingya leader came to attended the International Religious Freedom Forum, and when he asked President Trump about assistance for the Rohingya, President Trump said, where is that? So not a very encouraging sign, and so just an appeal, which I think some of the other panelists will go into a little bit more, but thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Olivia. Thanks, everybody. I'm really grateful to be here, and it's nice to see all of you here. So the plan, I was going to share a bit of our documentation with regard to the crime of genocide. And I think rather than just simply recap what's taken place over the last couple years, I thought I would do a recap of events in Rakhine State since 2012. I mean, one can very reasonably go back decades in taking a look at the atrocity crimes. But going back to 2012, particularly for anybody here who might not be as familiar with the last several years, there was tit-for-tat violence in Rakhine State between Muslims, mostly Rohingya Muslims and Buddhists, mostly Rakhine Buddhists. I was there at the time. At the time, I was working with Human Rights Watch, and I had documented how initially Rakhine had killed Rohingya, and Rohingya had also killed Rakhine. And then this quickly escalated into what were targeted state-sanctioned attacks against not only Rohingya, but also Kaman Muslims. So similar to the more recent attacks, taking a look at what happened in 2012, I think it's disturbing, but it's also instructive. There were also two waves of violence back in 2012, first in June and then in October. The second wave of violence back then was more coordinated and catastrophic, very similar to what happened recently. So back in 2012, there was ultimately violence in 13 out of the 17 townships in Rakhine State. Armed civilians and state security forces committed massacres. They committed mass rape. They burned homes down. And at the time, there was one particular case that I was recalling the other day and thinking about remarks to share here today, and it was the situation in Yanthe Village in Raku Township. So on October 23rd, 2012, mobs of armed civilians, effectively supported by state security forces, descended on Yanthe Village. They massacred 70 people. 28 of those people that they massacred were children. 13 of those children were under the age of 5. They were all buried in mass graves. There was no accountability whatsoever. So tellingly, just before that attack, state security forces had gone into the village and effectively and disarmed the Rohingya civilians. So they took away sticks, knives, other sharp equipment that could be used in self-defense. This is exactly what we saw in the lead up to 2017. It's often stated that those attacks in 2012 displaced 120,000, mostly Rohingya. And as Dan mentioned, that's because there are roughly 128,000 Rohingya confined to just over 20. I think the last count was like 28 internment camps, maybe in 5 different townships. But those attacks in 2012 actually displaced a lot more than 120,000 people. Between 2012 and 2015, there were at least, and it's a conservative estimate, at least 170,000 Rohingya boarded ships bound for Thailand and Malaysia. Many of those people died at sea. Many of those people died in Thailand or in Malaysia. Many are buried in mass graves. Some of those mass graves haven't even been accounted for yet. So the death toll stemming from 2012 is considerably higher than has ever been acknowledged. And certainly the displacement is a lot higher than just the people who are eking out a living confined to these internment camps. In 2014, some of you may recall there was a group of Rohingya who attacked and killed a member of the Myanmar police force. The authorities responded brutally and killed untold number of civilians in a village called Duchiradan. I've met and interviewed survivors and eyewitnesses of the Duchiradan massacre. The UN reported on it. Rohingya reported on it extensively. And despite the evidence, there are actually still members of the diplomatic community who don't believe anything happened in that village. 1 year later, in 2015, this is when at Fortify Rights we started to call for an independent international investigation of the situation in Rakhine. We published a report that year with a team from Yale Law School that found strong evidence that the crime of genocide was taking place in Rakhine State then. So this is 2005. This was more than a year before the October 2016 attacks, and obviously a couple years before the even larger attacks. The 2015 report that we put out found evidence of state responsibility for genocide as opposed to individual criminal liability. And so this issue of state responsibility has gained some considerable traction just this week with the Gambia filing an application for a case against Myanmar for genocide at the International Court of Justice. So this brings us, of course, up to the attacks in 2016, 2017. And obviously it's been very well established following ARSA's 2 attacks that killed several state security forces. Soldiers and civilian perpetrators slit throats. They fatally shot Rohingya at close range and at distances. Many people were burned alive. They laid landmines that killed and maimed civilians as they fled. Soldiers stomped infants and threw some into rivers in flames. Raped and gang raped women and girls in horrific numbers, in some cases mutilated bodies. So the authorities also were destroying homes. They were destroying civilian objects, civilian homes, religious structures, means of subsistence, all of the types of things that point to the crime of genocide. The dominant narrative at the time was that, which many governments even came to accept, was just that the Myanmar military responded spontaneously to the ARSA attack. And what we were able to demonstrate in a report we published in July 2018 was that they had actually made extensive preparations for those attacks. The Myanmar authorities have, that is. I'd be happy to share more about those specific preparations, but specifically on the crime of genocide requires the commission of one of 5 prohibited acts, criminal acts committed against a protected group with the intent to destroy in whole or in part. So our report analyzes what our documentation in the context of the Genocide Convention. And what we found was that, we found, similar to the fact-finding mission report, reasonable grounds to believe that the Myanmar Army, police force, border guards, and civilian perpetrators committed atrocities that constitute genocide. So in terms of recommendations and what the U.S. in particular could do, For starters, we're suggesting that all governments, not just the U.S., but certainly the U.S., could and should support the Gambia's case at the ICJ. The authorities could the government could issue public statements. They could provide financial, diplomatic, substantive support. It would be helpful if the U.S. Issued interpretations of the Genocide Convention with regard to the crimes against the Rohingya. This would assist the Gambia's case. And in theory, that shouldn't be particularly challenging given the amount of evidence that the State Department has collected. And further to that, we are calling on the U.S. government to issue a genocide determination on the situation of the Rohingya in Myanmar. We've also called for and are continuing to call for the establishment of a criminal tribunal to investigate and try the crimes. In the absence of a UN Security Council referral to the ICC, a criminal tribunal could be established, and there's of course precedent there. Like others, we're also encouraging military-owned, the U.S. to sanction military-owned enterprises. Some months ago, we did catch wind of this idea circulating that sanctioning military-owned enterprises would somehow hurt the Myanmar economy. We've been speaking with young entrepreneurs in Myanmar who tell us that if military-owned enterprises were sanctioned, it would actually enable them to have more market share. It would enable them to, for example, have a shot at what are otherwise no-bid contracts, and it would perhaps create a fair economy. Lastly, I just want to take a chance to close. I want to mention emphasize that the language and the findings in the 2018 fact-finding mission report with respect to the crime of genocide are actually a lot more explicit and clear than many people have acknowledged. On an almost weekly basis, we're seeing it's suggested that the fact-finding mission somehow didn't make a genocide determination, or that's for a court to decide. We hear that very often. So if you take a look at the fact-finding mission report, the large report, the 441-page report, the section on genocide, they find that 1, the Rohingya are a protected group under the Genocide Convention. 2, perpetrators committed 4 of the 5 acts of genocide. And 3, that perpetrators demonstrated genocidal intent. That is a genocide determination. So building on that, the report says, and here I quote, "It is now for a competent prosecutorial body and a court of law to investigate and adjudicate cases against specific individuals to determine individual guilt or innocence." So with the fact-finding mission, they did not say it's for a court to determine if genocide occurred. What they said was genocide occurred, and now it's for a court to determine what specific individuals are responsible for that. And so I think, whether it's governments, human rights organizations, or journalists, I think it's very helpful. It could be very helpful for us to go back and revisit what the fact-finding mission actually said. So again, thank you so much, and I'll end there. Thanks.
Thank you, Matt. All right.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dan and Matt, for your very insightful presentation. And I echo you both and the report of the fact-finding mission. One of the things that I realized at the fact-finding mission report is that the recommendations are very constructive and holistic. And I think we have to look into that. When we approach accountability processes, we have to be holistic. What does that mean is even, let's say, if we're able to prosecute the crimes of genocide, we might not still be able to address the root causes in the ground. We might not be able to, we might not see the actual change in the ground. That is why we believe that all kind of pressures and holistic approach on the accountability is essential, which include economic disengagement of economic activities with the military in Myanmar, and all other sanctions, including arms embargo, and all of you know have been calling. And at the same time, I guess that when we talk about root causes, as I said, the crimes of genocide, it's beyond crimes of genocide. the root causes, what we have been talking about, sometimes it has not been clear among each other, between us, what does that mean by root causes? For us as a Rohingya, the root cause of the conflict itself, crisis itself, is first denial of the Rohingyas' existence as a group in the country. It's not just about denial of a name, but in the denial of the group existence and the rights, the political, social rights as a group in the country, the equal rights of a group in the country. In Western world, it is difficult to understand what is the group rights mean. It has always been from the individual right approach. Whenever the INGOs or government approach to talk with the Burmese government, it's end up having the individual rights approach. And I do believe that makes sense, and it is easier for the Western world to understand and to solve the conditions. Like if you are able to improve like individuals' rights, for example, like granting them citizenship, granting me, Weiwei, or Matt citizenship rights, they assume that you can basically restore rights of the people. But in reality, in the context of Myanmar, it is much more complex than individual rights. While as a group, if we are denied, when we call for the individual rights, we will never get the individual equal rights. We will end up getting lesser rights. What does that mean is the lesser rights mean you might be able to, I might become a naturalized citizen. It's mean for the Western American, it makes sense you have citizenship rights and you are able to vote. But in Myanmar, it's the naturalized citizens or lesser citizenship rights it's very discriminatory, and it is very problematic. So to achieve equal citizenship rights and equal rights in Myanmar, we have to be able to acknowledge, the government has to acknowledge and recognize the Rohingya as a group and the Rohingya rights. So I think sometimes some of the organizations and the countries think that has been controversial. Unless we are able to address the group rights, the Rohingyas' rights, we might not be able to address the root causes. There will be always discrimination in the country and always apartheid-like condition. So that's I think the most essential. And sometimes I also feel like majority of, many people in terms of when you talk about Burma, they've been kind of normalizing normalizing or internalizing the Burmese government narrative that the Rohingya does not include in the country, and this is a separate issue. It has to be dealt with as a separate issue, or the people, like majority of the Rohingya are already gone, like me, they become refugees. So you have only few people now. This is not important to. This is the issue has been somehow separated from the Burmese main politics and main like the whole country's democratizations or all these processes. It's somehow internalized by many of us, and that is something that I think we have to be very careful. For example, we have elections in 2020, and nobody has been actually talking about Rohingyas' political rights, which has been there until 2010. We were able to participate in all elections in the country since 1935 to 2010, and the Rohingya were able to vote and able to participate. It has only been a disenfranchised in the last elections in 2014, but no elections actors seems to be talking about this issue. So I think this is very important that you take actions. Call the U.S. government to talk about the political rights of the Rohingya in next upcoming elections in 2020. I think these are two major things that I would like to highlight. One other thing that I would like to talk about is the Aung San Suu Kyi government policy. We talk about criminal accountability, sanctioning military and its businesses. I mean, that's great, and that's very essential and important. At the same time, we also have to acknowledge that Dosu government is part of the problem now. And they are the perpetrators for the ongoing genocide, ongoing persecution. The Dosu government is the most responsible government that has been legalizing all these discriminatory practices, discriminatory policies, and continuing the apartheid condition in Rakhine State. As Dan has said, their so-called Rakhine State Advisory Commission's recommendations implementation has been actually used to create further apartheid and segregations in Rakhine State. For example, the case of camps closure, there is no plans of return of the Rohingyas to their places of origin, whether for the IDPs or for the refugees. Their plan is to build camps and these so-called modern villages where they will concentrate the majority of the Rohingya and isolate, continue these segregation practices. And that has been very, very problematic, and that's just one example. All other approaches in terms of education, healthcare, everything has been the same. And her government is, being a democratic government, she's the one who is denying the entire crimes in Rakhine State and refusing to engage with the international mechanisms, so including fact-finding missions and IIMM. And her government has been actively trying to whitewash the military's crimes in Rakhine State by setting up these so-called independent commissions of inquiry and other effort. So they have been putting so much effort to really try to undermine international advocacy processes and accountability processes. Our government has funded an NGO, the Myanmar Trade Union, to submit a submission to the ICC, basically, so that to provide the government narrative of the condition. And so there are many other efforts that our government has been doing, since they came into power. And actually, our government has announced last year to conduct a research on the Rohingya to prove that Rohingya never exists in the country under the religious ministry. So they will be releasing the publication research very soon on that. And at the same time, the criminalizations of Rohingyas movement have continued. Even last week of October, 28 Rohingya has been arrested while they're trying to come from Rakhine State to inner part of Myanmar. Perhaps they are trying to flee to Malaysia. We don't know what was their objective to come, but they have been arrested and sentenced to 2 years. And yesterday, there were 7 other Rohingya were arrested, and they will be sentenced to 2 years, which include the children and women as well. And this kind of practice has been there for many years. And these issues has become very public. The Burmese media publicize this with very kind of humiliatory comments and titles. And this issue is the arrest of the Rohingya. They have actually published, or they have actually report the cases as a victory for being able to arrest the Rohingya illegal Bengali. And the government is aware of it. The parliamentarian from her party has raised questions at the parliament. What is the plan of the government to really further restrict movement of these people so that they are not able to come inside Burma from Rakhine State? So this is like a kind of like, very obvious and public issues that has been happening in the last few months, yet the practices has continued under the NLD government. So we feel like it is time for us to really hold the civilian government accountable as well, to stop the ongoing persecutions against the Rohingya. It is unacceptable that the democratic government has been using violating the international crimes or continue persecuting the Rohingya. And they have been given so much the world has been very reluctant to really call on her and her government's crimes with the name of democracy. The Rohingya, the Burmese democracy will never succeed. If the Rohingya rights are not restored and secure, and we cannot expect to have democracy at the expense of Rohingyas. And I think that's all for now. I'm happy to answer question and answers.
Thank you. Francisco?
Great. Thank you so much, Olivia and Heritage Foundation, for having this important event. Thank you for the other panelists as well, particularly Wei Wei, who's such a fierce advocate on these set of issues, and outspoken member of her community as well. I know there's nothing else going on in DC, so thank you for all being here as we go through our own democratic experiment. It's good to know that DC can also focus on issues happening in other parts of the world. I've been asked to focus my remarks primarily on sort of U.S. policy with respect to the Rohingya crisis. What I'll say about Amnesty International is that we've been documenting human rights abuses in Myanmar for decades. And while this event focuses primarily on the Rohingya, it's not just human rights abuses against the Rohingya that's happening in Myanmar. And so even as of September of this year, we came out with a report that documented war crimes that were going on by the Myanmar military against the Kachin, in Kachin and in Shan State. Cases of arbitrary detention, torture, where the military was using schools as barracks against many of the ethnic, minorities within these part of the country. And it all kind of gets to this sort of one of the main themes, I think, that has come out at this, which is that the military continues to be an unaccountable institution that is completely separate from the civilian government. And until there is actual criminal accountability and the international community actually forces the military to change its behavior, it's going to continue to act with impunity. So I think that's one of the main things that we've been sort of looking at and focusing on when it comes to our recommendations that we've been pushing for throughout our movement. But on U.S. policy, one of the things that I always like to start off with when I'm talking about where U.S. policy is on this issue is sort of this quote that was said in May of this year. So President Trump's first Secretary of State, in a closed testimony with the House Foreign Affairs Committee, said that one of their greatest disappointments of his was the situation in Myanmar. And he says that after a lot of hard work, including going there, I didn't feel like I was able to move the needle one bit, and it was extremely disappointing to me. So this was sort of gave us an insight into how one of the senior administration officials felt, despite having, in his view, worked really hard to sort of improve the crisis within Myanmar. But what are the different pillars of U.S. policy with respect to the Rohingya crisis? The first is the humanitarian assistance. So in September of this year, the U.S. announced more than 127 million in additional humanitarian assistance for Rohingya refugees and host communities in Bangladesh and IDPs, Rohingyas, and members of the affected community inside Burma. And the U.S. still remains the largest contributor of humanitarian response to the crisis in Burma and Bangladesh, providing more than 669 million since the outbreak of violence in August 2017. And during the past 20 years, USAID has provided assistance to vulnerable communities in Myanmar, not just in Rakhine, but also in Kachin and Shan State. This was raised by Dan, but this administration in particular has sort of used religious freedom, in particular the Religious Freedom Ministerial, to raise the profile and the plight of the Rohingya. There was a statement of concern during the International Religious Freedom Ministerial, where the idea was to bring other like-minded countries to sort of join the United States in raising concerns on religious freedom issues in Myanmar. Dan correctly highlighted an instance in which, President Trump met with several of these affected communities, and we saw where one of those people, Reverend Sampson, an influential leader in Kachin, was subsequently threatened after he returned back home. And the United States then subsequently sent a strong statement, really putting a spotlight that if anything were to happen to him, there would be serious consequences. Secretary Pompeo, at several instances, has said that that they want to see a Burma that where the conditions are provide for the safe, voluntary, dignified, and sustainable repatriation for the return of displaced Rohingya. Most recently, as at the East Asia Summit, the United States announced, as part of its Indo-Pacific Transparency Initiative and part of its public diplomacy program, good governance and freedom of the press type of funding with respect to journalists and educators in Burma that sort of helps sort of press freedom and media landscape in Burma so that they could hopefully do more in terms of promoting transparency and good governance within the country. One that is an area that has taken a lot of interest here in Washington, including by Amnesty, is also this idea of sanctions, whether and what form they take. So it's important to remember that in July of this year, the Department of State publicly designated individuals, including their family members, for gross violations of human rights violations. And according to U.S. law, if they designate them as gross violators of human rights, then they have to be imposed visa sanctions. And that included the commander of chief Min Aung Hlaing, as well as 3 other military officials. One of the areas that we've highlighted and pointed out is that in some ways that was already in the books, given that the JADE Act, which was enacted in the early 2000s, has passed, which is already a law in the book, blocked many of these Myanmar officials already from visiting, but it's still an important step for the United States to designate Min Aung Hlaing as a gross violator of human rights. Also, if you look back the year before that, in August of 2018, the U.S. Treasury sanctioned 4 Burmese military individuals and border guard police commanders and 2 Burmese military units. So that's the 99th Light Infantry Division and the 33rd Light Infantry Division. These are 2 combatant commands that both Amnesty and Reuters identified as being complicit in some of the worst human rights abuses that we found in Myanmar, and are still, unfortunately, the same units which we documented in September being used in other parts of the country. We also So, that sort of gets to what now, and sort of where is the human rights community sort of looking at, well, I'll only speak for Amnesty International. One of the areas that we're still very much focused on is sort of what congressional action will happen. So as you all are probably aware, the House of Representatives in sort of the summer passed the Burma Act as a standalone bill. It also passed the Burma Act as a part of the National Defense Authorization Act. And so while those negotiations are ongoing, and there still has not been a conference proposal that has been made public on sort of whether the Burma Act was included into the final National Defense Authorization Act. We've been calling on particularly senators and Senator McConnell, since we know he's been the main obstacle in the past, to show support for the Burma Act and to allow it for final inclusion. We've also been specifically calling for any inclusion of expanding military-to-military cooperation, for that to not be in any final proposal in the Military Defense Authorization Bill. And one of our calls actually has been consistently for an arms embargo, a global arms embargo. So as part of U.S. congressional law, in previous national defense authorization bills, there are really strong restrictions upon any U.S. military cooperation with the Tamada. And so we would think it would be incumbent on the U.S. to use that to sort of call for a global arms embargo with other like-minded countries, something you could refer to at the UN Security Council or at various UN forums, something it has yet to do. Another area that they have yet to do as well is sort of this idea of a legal determination. Congress provided and appropriated funds for the State Department to conduct their own investigation. And we heard and we were, sort of seeing various of the groups that were consulting with the State Department, that conducted the research with the State Department, and we're very hopeful that that would lead to a legal determination based by the U.S. State Department. Unfortunately, at one point, the State Department decoupled the legal determination process from the documentation process, and simply issued a report, which was, of course, welcomed because it's always good for the State Department to be doing its own human rights documentation, but it fell short of actually making a legal determination whether, which crimes under international law were specifically conducted, whether it was genocide, crimes against humanity, or, war crimes. And so that was a real disappointing moment for many civil society advocates who were watching U.S. policy pretty closely. This was touched on earlier, but there's been a lot that's been going on with respect to international criminal, justice mechanisms. And so I think it's incumbent upon the U.S. to also signal its support, whether it's for the IIMM, the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar, or whether it's with the most recent case that was discussed earlier with respect to the ICJ and Gambia sort of filing suit. So there's a lot that the U.S. could be doing in these various multilateral bodies, and from Amnesty's views, we've been calling them to pursue all routes that call for accountability and justice. So I'll leave it there, and thank you for having us again. So.
Great. Well, I should have mentioned at the outset that this event is co-hosted with Refugees International. And when Dan and I were originally thinking up this event and sort of thinking about what we wanted it to be for the future, we really wanted to make sure that on the panel we had a whole range of views and perspectives and priorities that were represented. And obviously Dan comes with this immense humanitarian background. Matt has done so much work on genocide-related issues and on-the-ground work in Burma. Of course, Weiwei has the perspective, being a Rohingya herself, of the situation, and then Francisco works on all of the policy issues. And so we wanted it to be both representative in terms of the different policy priorities, but also the different political perspectives. And I think it's fascinating, sitting up here just observing this, that pretty much everyone mentioned the extent to which the Burmese military is the one that is the perpetrators of this violence that's going on there. And I think that that's something definitely worth dwelling on. I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and ask a question, but in the meantime, those in the audience, please be thinking about any questions that you might have to ask, because we will open it up to the audience. But as the moderator, I just wanted to ask, all of you brought up particular policy solutions that you thought were really important, and each of you listed several. If you had only one that the U.S. government could do, what would it be and why? We'll start maybe with Francisco, since he's the most policy focused and offered a ton of recommendations.
So if there's like a wish list or just of one,
A single wish list and why?
I mean, I think it would be for the U.S. to refer the situation to the International Criminal Court.
For me, it would be what I ended with the need for U.S. leadership, and a concrete way of doing that is to, and we've recommended this in the past, is to assign a high-level administration official to coordinate with allies on this to really push for international pressure. And so that would be the main kind of concrete step that could go towards building that pressure.
I think if I had to choose one, I think I'd agree with Francisco and something related to justice and accountability. I think like an ICC referral, for example. But part of the reason for that, the reason why, is that one of our biggest areas of focus is just prevention. There's a very real risk that we could all wake up tomorrow to another round of mass killings. I think the certain generals are a bit concerned, as they should be, about international justice, but the more mechanisms that are in place and the more avenues that are in place, I think one of the effects that hopefully would be to prevent future killings.
Oh, this is very hard for me. You asked me a very hard question to choose. Like, which children do you like the most, right? Just like that. I'm like, I would just say U.S. It's quite discouraging to see U.S. Is kind of U.S. has been a bit inactive in the situations of Myanmar. The previous government has failed, actually. Not only just inactive, but also failed to prevent the genocide. And this government is somehow ignorant. So it's feel very discouraging. So I wish they take more active leadership to really bring accountability and justice for the Rohingya. One of the key essential thing will be referring the case to the ICC or the taking leadership in UNGA to establish an independent criminal court. So that would be the most important thing. Otherwise, they can still leverage in many sectors, for example, like in terms of influencing in development aid and policies and projects. Currently, there is a big project ongoing by the World Bank, and U.S. still can be a crucial role to block the projects in Rakhine State while the situations remain as apartheid. Those kind of things, being more active role in terms of changing policies in the ground and taking leaderships in the criminal accountability and using their presence inside Burma, leverage their power to bring people together, maybe basically facilitate a dialogue between the government and Rohingya, so that we can find a solutions in the ground.
Okay, so
But don't ask me to choose one. It's difficult for me.
So I lied about asking only one question. I'm going to permit myself one follow-up question. So the general theme with all of your guys' answers was the need for accountability and justice and the need for U.S. leadership. Matt, in your remarks, you mentioned that there might be alternative judicial mechanisms to pursue. Given that this administration is not very favorable to an ICC referral, what type of alternatives are you thinking about, and how does that how is that born out of the experience with some of the failures of other alternative judicial mechanisms? I'm thinking specifically about the ECCC in the Cambodian context. Just curious, and this is open to everyone on the panel, but Matt, given your comments.
Yeah, well, I think they could exercise authority under Chapter 7 to create an independent criminal tribunal. The Security Council could, that is. Just this morning, the former Special Rapporteur Thomas Quintana and our Rohingya friend and colleague Tun Kin and his organization and two Argentinian organizations filed for a universal jurisdiction case against, they've petitioned the court to do a criminal investigation into the Rohingya genocide in Argentina. And so obviously it doesn't involve the U.S., but I think in terms of alternative ways to achieve justice, I think seeing more universal jurisdiction cases would be important.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I just add that, through the ICC is pursuing what it feels that it can pursue, short of the UN Security Council referral, and that is pursuing the crime of deportation, because Myanmar is not a party to the ICC, but Bangladesh is, and so there was a finding that because this crime of deportation started in Myanmar and continued into Bangladesh, which is a party, that this can be pursued. So that's just one more avenue that's being pursued, and I think is important.
So I think logistically or procedurally, I think if we are able to push the U.S. to refer the case to the ICC, it will be very easy, as they are already pursuing the case on Myanmar. So I think, it will be very challenging, but we still want to keep hope and keep pushing the U.S. government and others in the Security Council, because this is the easiest way in terms of logistic. Otherwise, establishing a new criminal tribunal is not easy thing. It may have many other challenges. So, we are still open to that, but if we can, the best case scenario, if we are able to push for the ICC, that would be the best. But we're not going to even open for discussions about ECCC-like court or hybrid or any kind of hybrid tribunal, and it is very dangerous. I don't think in the case of Burma, we should even mention about it.
Totally agree with that. Great. So if you have a question, we'll have some folks who have a microphone. Please ask an actual question and state your name and affiliation. Go here.
Hi, I'm Simon Billanes with the International Campaign for the Rohingya. And I thought that, Wei Wei Nu made a very good point that it's not about, finding one particular tactic. It's about using a lot of different pressure points and finding ways to coordinate those so that they build on each other. And so I was wondering if you could also speak to the fact that, we're having some problems in getting sanctions through Congress, but that's not the only way to, for instance, get at the Burmese military's business interests. And, there was a very good Amnesty report on Kirin Brewing of Japan, which has caused a lot of pressure on that company over its partnership with the Burmese military. So I was wondering if you could speak to the effectiveness and scope for campaigns that go directly after the Burmese military's business interests by getting foreign companies to stop doing business with them.
I'll start off, but although I think other folks, please weigh in afterwards. So we found in the Kirin example, and just so you all know, Kirin is a Japanese beer company. We had, in one of our reports, we had found that they basically gave a cache of money. I have to be very careful what I say publicly, but basically, very loosely saying, they gave a cache of money to the Myanmar military right before some of the worst atrocities happened. And in one of our reportings, I think it named specific individuals within the Tamada and sort of had, had found sort of the specific timing and when and where. So there was a lot of backlash that happened as a result of this, particularly in Japan. As you all know, Amnesty International has sections all around the world, and Amnesty Japan really used this as an opportunity to raise the pressure on that company. And Kirin subsequently, made sure it was going to do its due diligence and apologized for it. And I haven't followed the latest in terms of what they did after that, but I know that they, certainly took steps. They paid attention, which I think is ultimately the lesson learned here. Then the question is, how can we use that as a model for other companies? I think other places, and I know you've been working on this, Simon, have looked at other companies in particular, and I don't know if other folks on the panel have done documentation on other companies. I can just say that since I cover all of Asia Pacific, that no market is too big for public pressure of a company. And, so for example, Amnesty International also led the campaign on Project Dragonfly, which was against Google, who was operating in China, which, as you all know, is a much bigger market than Myanmar. And because of the power of public outcry, the power of employees who were concerned about it, and just really making sure that this stayed in the headlines, and then eventually congressional pressure as well. As a part of that, it really led to effective, essentially Google announcing the end to Project Dragonfly in China. So, I certainly think it could be replicated with other industries. So.
And just briefly on the sanctions front, I mean, I think a lot of times we are very focused on new legislation or new authorities that could be used. But as I mentioned, and also I highlighted in the paper, the JADE Act technically is still relevant. I mean, we can still use those sanctioning authorities. And even without a unique Burma sanctions program at Treasury's disposal, global Magnitsky can be done in one-off fashions. And so I think that there is this need to really reiterate that the tools are already there. And of course, if you were to see action on Capitol Hill, this would put greater pressure on the administration to make use of tools that they already have, and of course be aware of other tools that exist. But I think that it is important as, civil society actors to just continue to reiterate the fact that tools already exist, and we should be using them to the fullest extent possible. And I would also just echo the primary money laundering concern designation under Section 311 of the USA Patriot Act. I mentioned that at the beginning. That's something that's on the books. It can be used for any country. And so we need to be thinking about the tools that are already available and using them to the full extent as it's possible and as it's within our means to do so. Great. Yes.
Thank you. Hello, Carol Gunsberg with Voice of America. I'm wondering if you could talk just a little bit about efforts to improve conditions for IDP, for people who are actually in the camps.
Dan?
You mean, in camps in Rakhine State? Sure. So, yeah, as far as improving conditions in Rakhine State, I mean, it's unfortunately continues to be effectively open-air prisons. There is no freedom of movement. And as I mentioned, even when you see camps that have been supposedly closed, people are just moving right next to it and don't have any more freedom of movement. And I should say also people we interviewed who got the national verification cards didn't get any additional benefits for freedom of movement. So without that freedom of movement, fundamentally, it's tough to get conditions to improve. In terms of in Bangladesh, that's I mean, on the one hand, if you look at where the camps were in the first weeks and even months to where they are today, the conditions have improved in terms of just the organization and access to services and more clarity in the referral pathways and things like that. But these are very crowded camps. There's a lot of criminality. There's a lot of gender-based violence going on. So there are a lot of efforts and resources going in. But I think the most troubling thing is seeing some of these increased restrictions that are going on, or increased burdens on NGOs that are working there. The big risk is that as we get further into this, then you have donor fatigue, and there's less resources there, even as the needs continue to go forward.
Can I just add something on that too?
Yeah, go ahead.
So there are still avoidable deprivations in humanitarian aid to the internment camps, education, healthcare, maternal mortality is a big problem. As Dan mentioned, restrictions on freedom of movement. I mean, they're essentially open-air prisons, I think, as you accurately referred to them. But I just want to mention also that the World Bank is contemplating development projects in Rakhine State, and they're contemplating doing development work in the camps, which, however well-intentioned that may be, there's a very high risk that they will any sort of project in the internment camps would essentially prop up what is an apartheid system. And so we would strongly advise the bank to proceed very carefully and very, very slowly to make sure that they're not doing harm.
Yes, because of the restrictions of movement, I think there won't be any improvement of the living conditions in IDP camps until unless they release these restrictions. So yeah, because they can't do anything inside the camps, and they cannot go out to pursue other opportunities. Meanwhile, I think there are, it's still small chance that we will be able to do some work. I think there are some also attention increasing around that. Basically, like more educational skill-based programs for the IDP youth and women, and finding a way to do some sort of microfinancing. So some of this innovative way could improve a bit of their life, but it doesn't necessarily mean the situations has overall generally would improve unless they're able to return to their places of origin and the government remove the restrictions around them.
And I know your question is only about IDPs, but I did want to broaden and expound just very briefly on this issue of restrictions, especially on freedom of movement. So one of the reasons that I moved from just like purely outrage after reading the UN fact-finding mission report to like, oh, I need to write a report now, was because I read in the fact-finding mission report that the restriction on freedom of movement for Rohingya to return was actually used as a fundraising mechanism by the Burmese military. So they raised $10.2 million in 3 separate fundraising efforts. And the fundraising efforts were specifically to build a wall so that the Rohingya people could not return to the land that was rightfully theirs. And beyond this, this land in many cases has already been burned, has already been bulldozed, has been razed. But the Burmese military had the audacity to go out and fundraise based off of the atrocities that they had committed so that they could further restrict freedom of movement. This is a story that I think needs to be told and told over and over and over again, because this is just absolutely blatant violations of the most fundamental aspects of freedom. And I think this is a really, really clear example of that. Yes.
Is that USAID told if Bangladesh can't stop human trafficking, they will stop funding. Do you think it will create new problem for Bangladesh to helping Rohingya people?
Well, I'll take a stab at that. I think I think your question is if the U.S. government cuts funding because Bangladesh isn't demonstrating progress on trafficking, that what effect would that have on? I see. Well, I mean, I think the answer is really for Bangladesh to to make every possible effort to curb human trafficking. Human trafficking from the camps is still a big problem, and in fact, just before the August 2017 attacks, we were speaking with women who had been trafficked from the camps to Middle Eastern countries and were being used essentially as slave labor. And so that was happening and has been happening for many, many years. But there's other trafficking going on. But I think, yeah, certainly. I mean, we wouldn't want to see resources cut that would otherwise help the refugee population.
And just to be clear, the reason that individual countries are placed on various tiers in the annually released State Department's Trafficking in Persons report is not because human trafficking is occurring in the country, but it measures the extent to which governments are undertaking efforts to comply with the minimum standards to eliminate trafficking in persons. So there may be a country that has an enormous trafficking problem, but is taking efforts to comply with the minimum standards laid out in the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. And there may be a country that has a more limited trafficking problem, but is not making any efforts to comply. So it's fully within the Bangladesh government's ability to take those efforts and make those efforts to comply for that situation to be changed. And I believe, I may be speaking out of turn here, but USAID funding and its subsequent revocation is most likely based off of Bangladesh's ranking in the Trafficking in Persons report, and it's fully within the government's ability to make those efforts to comply with the minimum standards. Yes, Michael.
Hi, I'm Mike Martin from Congressional Research Service. There's a community that I haven't heard much about, which isn't the ones in IDP camps or in Bangladesh, but actually still at home, still in the parts of Rakhine State that were predominantly Rohingya. It also happens to be the area where now the Arakan Army and the Tatmadaw are fighting. Yeah. Okay, so I was wondering, there's also an internet blackout in the area that's been imposed. Last I knew, international humanitarian assistance access is highly limited to the region. Media access to the region is also restricted. It's like a little black hole in the country, save for what we get from the government-run media about how the conflict's going or other sources. Could any of the panelists sort of address what is the status of the Rohingya population that weren't displaced but actually are still in their communities, but now subject both to this isolation imposed by the Tatmadaw and the Myanmar government, as well as now the conflict with the Arakan Army?
Can I? So one of the very important factor that we have to recognize here is after the fighting between the AA and Myanmar military, the Rakhine and the Rohingya has come to in a, like not consensus, in a way that I guess has the building and the trust between the two communities has sort of improved. There has been so much communication, actually even to me as well. Like the Rakhine activists and like youth are sending me messages and information to what is going on in Rakhine side as well as the Rohingya side. And they were asking me that this is a fight against the Burmese intruders. We have to fight together. So that's one thing that we have to acknowledge. And I think it's very important. The Myanmar government has been saying that, we cannot improve the situations in Rakhine State because these people don't like each other. And that's a lie. That's not true. Secondly, what is the situations in the ground for the Rohingya in the villages? I would say that their situation is not different as people in IDP camps. People in IDP camps are concentrated in a large camp, but the people in the villages, those who are not in IDP camps, are concentrated in their own villages, with even small number among small number of people. What does that mean is they cannot communicate with the people from outside of most of the time outside of their villages. So they cannot travel still from one village to another village. So that's one aspect when it comes to the freedom of movement. On the other hand, the security side of it is very concerning because the safety and security has further entrenched because of the fighting. They have no protection. So for the Rakhine, if they are being targeted or attacked by the Myanmar military, they, somehow there is the community protection sort of environment, and the AA, there is some sort of protections from, from the side of AA as well, while AA also has been increasingly violating the human rights during the fighting. So basically, there are more and more forced labors against of the Rohingya by both AA and the Burma military. There are extrajudicial killing. The fighting has directly been affected. Not only the Rohingya but also the Rakhine. Both community has been killed and dead due to the fighting, and forced disappearance and arbitrary arrest has been ongoing. I talked to my grandma last week. They wanted to buy a small refrigerator because my grandma is 85 years old, and she needs regular. If they cannot go to the market, they need to store some food, but yet they did not buy it. When I called last week, they said we did not buy because the fighting is ongoing next to the village. So we don't know what will happen. We don't know when we have to run from the village. So the situation is very uncertain and very, very concerning. So yeah.
And just quickly, that's exactly the population I was talking about, of who I interviewed, was people coming from those areas talking about what those conditions were like, where you did have the forced labor. You hear about people saying they were taken for a few days and building what they described as maybe security posts. They weren't sure. People being released from prison but forced to take the national verification cards, but not seeing any improvement in their freedom of movement. So yeah, it's to the point that things aren't getting better. It calls it, and not having a true vision of what's going on there, or having access for outside observers. It calls into question all of the things we've been talking about, from repatriation to any kind of World Bank development efforts. So it hasn't been getting better. It's actually getting worse, and there needs to be more transparency and access for international observers, independent observers.
Sir, you've been very patient over there.
Wes Rist, American Society of International Law. All of you, in your proposals for things that we could do moving forward, those policy recommendations were things that relied on U.S. government agents and actors taking steps. But the current status of the atrocity prevention groups in the different agencies and the interagency task force is horribly understaffed, some of them quite dramatically so. And as is the nature with policy considerations in the U.S. government, there's fighting about whose pet projects or whose issues take the lead. We just heard like a week ago that the September report for how much foreign direct investment facilitated by the U.S. government that went into Myanmar was like $4.1 billion. And the Myanmar investment promotion plan, I think it's called, or something, is like an aim for $20 billion or $200 billion over the next 20 years. And you've clearly got commercial interests trying to promote that from a U.S. policy perspective. So what's all of these wonderful recommendations, what's the actual method forward when you don't have the policy people in the administration or in the agencies who are physically able to make those assertions, or don't have the political clout to win out the policy argument when they're competing with the economic or regional desks that are promoting something different than the atrocity prevention or accountability mechanisms?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. Unfortunately, and this is not just true to Burma, but as you look throughout the region, you have economic forces and military forces who want to define the relationship between the U.S. and the region. Oftentimes, human rights concerns get sidelined to the bottom. I mean, yes, the atrocity prevention mechanisms in a lot of these agencies are depleted. Yes, morale is really bad. It's not, there are nobody to talk to. There are some folks that we meet with pretty regularly, and including in the National Security Council. So I don't want to make it sound like there's no one, moving paper forward, but I mean, that is a problem, right? So personnel is policy, and if there's no personnel, there's not a lot of policy going forward. But I think, to your other point, it's a question of political will. There's plenty of legal authorities, there's plenty of ideas, solutions. If there's not political will, and to get to Dan's point, particularly at the highest level, the fact that President Trump announced visa sanctions 4 days before meeting with a Myanmar official, but then not knowing what country that person was from or where that country was from, really speaks to the lack of leadership, that unfortunately is at the helm of U.S. policy on Myanmar. But as advocates, what we can try to do is identify those individuals who are in the bureaucracy, empower them to have all the resources and tools that they need to be able to affect the national security decision-making process, and hopefully things get done. I mean, we haven't seen nothing. I wouldn't say that, as sort of I laid out in sort of my 5 minutes. So I think hopefully we can try to see more, and that's where Congress also plays a role.
Yeah, I was going to say, not to be cliche, but I mean, that is one of the elements of the U.S. political system that, does in some ways make it resilient, but you have many branches of government. If the executive branch isn't doing it, you can put greater pressure on Congress to do what it needs to do. And I think Congress has long been the vehicle, especially for promotion of human rights, because the way the bureaucracy is set up, and this is not unique to this administration under Obama, under Bush, it doesn't matter whether it's an R or a D in the White House, the way that State Department and even DOD and even the NSC are set up, human rights issues are siloed from the regional bureaus, which everyone, even, your average person who's going into a State Department bureaucracy, when they're a young, whippersnapper and they're going into that bureaucracy, they don't want to work in DRL. They don't want to work at the Religious Freedom Office. They don't want to work in the trafficking space because they know that the way that it's currently structured actually de-emphasizes human rights. And it makes it seem as though human rights issues are separate from, or in addition to, or a optional priority if we happen to have time to do it. And the reality is that these issues, whether it's economic issues, national security issues, or human rights issues, are interlinked. And the responsibility for us as civil society is to call out government on this, to make it clear that there are national interest-based, national security-based, economic-based reasons for them to act on human rights issues, and vice versa, too. But I think that case isn't always being made, and it needs to be made more forcefully, needs to be made more thoughtfully and more strategically. And so I think we shouldn't feel totally, disempowered by the fact that maybe some bureaucrats in the executive branch aren't acting, but we should, really think about the other avenues that we do have for affecting change and work with those who are willing within the executive branch to move forward on those things. Unfortunately, we do have to close out the program. Thank you to everyone for joining us today. If you have questions, I think some of us will be able to stay up here and hopefully answer them, especially yours. Sorry to miss you, but thank you again for joining us. And if you didn't get a copy of both Francisco's report and my report, please feel free to grab it on the way out. Thank you. Thank you so much for coming.
It's a repeat of our
I'm sorry.
almost our full panel from.
No, I was busy and I